A pair of headlights cut through the dense, moonless night as a battered sedan navigated a narrow, winding road. The driver, Lena, squinted at the faded map sprawled across her passenger seat. Her GPS had given up an hour ago, its chipper voice reduced to mocking static in the mountains. She sighed, fingers gripping the wheel tighter, cursing the decision to take this so-called scenic shortcut. Beside her, Noah stirred awake from his nap. His groggy voice broke the silence. "Where are we?" "I don't know," Lena admitted. "The map says there should have been a turnoff for Willow Creek by now, but I must have missed it. We're in the middle of nowhere." Noah frowned, leaning forward to peer through the windshield. The road was hemmed in by dark trees, their bare branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. A heavy fog began to roll in, blanketing the ground and muffling the world outside. "Maybe we should go back?" Noah suggested. "This feels off." Before Lena could respond, the road suddenly forked, an unmarked dirt path veering sharply to the right. Without thinking, Lena turned the wheel. Gravel crunched under the tires as they veered onto the path, the main road swallowed by darkness behind them. The headlights illuminated a hand-painted sign nailed to a tree. Its letters, smeared and barely legible, read, "Mirrorwood." Beneath it, someone had hastily scrawled, "No entry after dusk." A shiver rippled through Lena. "This is probably just a joke," she said aloud, trying to reassure herself. "Yeah, let's hope," Noah muttered, sitting up straighter. The deeper they drove, the stranger the surroundings became. The trees grew impossibly tall, their branches knitting together overhead to form a suffocating canopy. The air grew cold, so cold that frost crept up the inside of the windshield. Noah rubbed his palms together, his breath visible. "You feeling that?" he asked, but Lena only nodded, her jaw clenched in concentration. The sedan jostled violently as they hit a deep rut, the engine sputtering in protest. Then the headlights caught movement ahead. A figure, no, several, lurched onto the road. They were humanoid but wrong. Their skins sagged in unnatural folds, their eyes gleamed like wet marbles, and their mouths hung open in grotesque, silent screams. Lena slammed the brakes and the car screeched to a halt mere feet from the figures. Noah cursed, fumbling to lock the doors as the figures approached. Lena's heart thundered in her chest as she fumbled with the gear shift, but the car wouldn't move. The figures circled them like vultures, their bony hands dragging over the windows, leaving streaks of something viscous behind. One of them bent down, peering directly into Lena's eyes. Its lips moved, forming words she couldn't hear, but the message was clear in her head. "You shouldn't have come here." The engine roared to life suddenly, as if jolted by an unseen force. Without thinking, Lena stomped the gas pedal and the car surged forward. The figures scattered, their misshapen bodies vanishing into the fog as the car rocketed down the dirt path. "Go back! Go back!" Noah shouted, but Lena couldn't. The road had changed. It twisted and looped unnaturally, each turn bringing them further from where they had been. She drove blindly, her knuckles white against the wheel, until they came upon a clearing. In the clearing sat a dilapidated cabin, its wooden frame sagging like a wounded animal. The sedan sputtered and died as if the cabin itself had drained its life force. The air was thick with the stench of mildew and rot. "We're not going in there," Noah said firmly, but Lena was already stepping out. She didn't know why, only that she had to. The cabin door creaked open as they approached, revealing a yawning darkness inside. Against every instinct, they stepped over the threshold. The door slammed shut behind them, and the air grew heavy, pressing against their lungs. The interior was sparse, an old table, a single chair, and a fireplace long extinguished, yet it felt occupied. Shadows moved where there shouldn't have been movement, and the faint sound of whispers seemed to rise from the walls. Lena reached for Noah's hand, but he wasn't there. She spun around in panic, her voice breaking as she called his name. The whispers grew louder, mocking her cries. Then she saw him. She saw him. Noah stood in the corner, unmoving, his face hidden in shadow. "Noah?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He turned slowly. His eyes were wrong, hollow and black, as if something had scooped out his soul. His lips parted, but the voice that came out wasn't his. It was a cacophony of others, layered and alien. "You took the wrong turn." The walls of the cabin began to writhe, the wood groaning as if alive. Faces pushed against the surface, their mouths gaping in silent pleas. The floor splintered beneath Lena's feet, and she fell, tumbling into an abyss of roiling shadows. The last thing she saw was Noah, or what used to be Noah, standing at the edge, watching her with empty eyes. Then there was only darkness. It started with the vanishing of animals. First, the neighbor's dog, a scrappy mutt named Rusty, disappeared, his chain found slack and chewed at the edge of the woods. Then the chickens, all 8 of them gone from their coop, no feathers, no tracks, just the eerie silence of the empty pen. When Jonah's tabby Socks didn't come home one night, he knew something was terribly wrong. But Jonah and his wife, Elise, couldn't leave. The old farmhouse in the middle of nowhere was all they had. They moved in 6 months ago, intent on fixing it up, but things had taken a turn. Strange sounds at night, shadows that didn't match their source, and now this. Still, Jonah insisted, we just need to tough it out. It's probably coyotes. Elise wasn't convinced, especially after the scarecrow appeared. It wasn't theirs. They didn't own a scarecrow. Yet one morning, as Jonah stepped outside to fetch the paper, there it was, standing at the edge of the cornfield. It looked ancient, its burlap face stitched together with uneven thread, button eyes mismatched and askew. Its straw body sagged under a rotted flannel shirt, and its wide-brimmed hat drooped low over its shoulders. "Where the hell did that come from?" Elise asked, standing in the doorway. "Someone's idea of a prank," Jonah replied, brushing it off. "Kids? Maybe." But there weren't any kids for miles. Their nearest neighbor was 5 miles out, and they didn't even have electricity on this side of the farm, let alone a group of mischievous teens. That night, the sound started again. A faint rustling outside their window, like someone, or something, dragging themselves through the dry corn stalks. Elise shook Jonah awake. "Do you hear that?" He groaned, irritated. "It's the wind." But when Jonah stepped outside the next morning, the scarecrow had moved. It was no longer at the edge of the field, but closer, about 20 feet from the house. The head was tilted as if watching the front door. "Elise," Jonah said uneasily, "did you?" "No," she snapped. "I haven't touched it." Jonah frowned and stomped toward the scarecrow. Up close, it was worse than it looked from the house. The stench hit him first, rotting meat. Flies buzzed around its straw hands, and Jonah noticed something dripping from the flannel sleeves. Dark, sticky, and congealed. The buttons of its eyes seemed to follow him as he moved. "Damned kids," he muttered under his breath, grabbing the thing by the arm. Its straw-stuffed limbs flopped unnaturally as he dragged it to the farthest end of the field. He staked it deep into the ground, patting the dirt over with his boot. When he returned, Elise was waiting for him, pale and shaking. She held something in her hands. A muddy Polaroid photo. "Where did you find this?" Jonah asked. But Elise didn't respond. She just stared at the image. It was a picture of the scarecrow, taken from the edge of the field. But it wasn't where Jonah had just left it. It was standing right at their porch, its head tilted toward the window where Elise had been. Jonah didn't sleep that night, not really. He kept the shotgun by the bed and listened to the rustling in the cornfield grow louder, more insistent. Elise stayed under the covers, her breathing shallow. At 3:14 a.m., the noise stopped. Jonah sat up, gripping the shotgun. The silence was suffocating. Even the wind had died. Then a single sound broke the stillness. A knock at the front door. "Knock! Knock! Elise?" Jonah whispered, but she didn't respond. Her body trembled under the blanket. "Knock! Knock!" He slid out of bed, his fingers wrapped tightly around the shotgun. The wooden floors creaked as he made his way down the hall. At the door, he hesitated, his heart pounding in his ears. The knock came again, louder this time. He flung the door open, the gun raised, and saw nothing. The porch was empty, the fields beyond bathed in moonlight. Jonah exhaled shakily, starting to lower the weapon when he felt it. The weight of eyes. He turned slowly. The scarecrow was standing in the middle of the porch, upright and free of its post. Its burlap face loomed inches from his, its mismatched button eyes staring into his soul. Jonah stumbled back, raising the gun, but the scarecrow moved faster than anything should. Its arms snapped forward, grabbing the barrel and bending it like a twig. The last thing Jonah saw was its mouth, no longer stitched shut, opening impossibly wide to reveal rows of teeth. Inside, Elise screamed as the front door slammed shut. The next morning, the farmhouse sat quiet, its windows dark. The scarecrow was back in the field. This time, it wasn't alone. A second figure stood beside it, slumped and motionless, wearing Jonah's clothes. Late one night, Amanda drove along Route 46, a back road infamous for its eerie isolation. She had left her best friend's house after a late-night study session, and the GPS suggested the shortcut. Despite its reputation, she figured it would save her 20 minutes. What harm could come from a quiet drive? The first few miles were uneventful, her headlights slicing through the inky darkness. Trees bordered the road, their twisted branches leaning like spectators over the cracked pavement. The only sounds were the hum of her engine and the occasional thud of her tires hitting uneven patches of asphalt. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. No signal. Figures, she muttered, dropping it onto the passenger seat. When she looked back at the road, her breath hitched. A figure stood in the distance, dead center in her lane. She slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. Her heart raced as she squinted through the windshield. The figure didn't move. It appeared to be a woman, dressed in a long, tattered gown that seemed out of place. Victorian, maybe? Her face was obscured by her long, dark hair, and her posture was unnaturally stiff. Amanda's headlights cast long shadows that danced around her like specters. Amanda rolled her window down slightly. "Hey, are you okay?" No response. She hesitated, glancing at the clock on the dashboard. Midnight. She didn't want to get out, not here, not now. But leaving someone stranded didn't sit right with her. Summoning her courage, Amanda opened the door and stepped into the cold night air. "Ma'am, do you need help?" The woman tilted her head slightly, an unnatural, jerky movement like a puppet on strings. Amanda froze. The woman's head snapped upward, revealing hollow sockets where her eyes should have been. Amanda staggered back, fumbling for the car door. Before she could get inside, the woman let out an ear-piercing scream. It wasn't human. It was guttural, a shriek that vibrated through Amanda's bones. Amanda jumped into the car, locking the doors. Her hands shook as she fumbled to start the engine. The headlights flickered, and the woman was suddenly gone. She sped down the road, her tires skidding as she took the curves too fast. The forest around her seemed to close in, the trees leaning so far overhead they blotted out the moonlight. Amanda glanced in her rearview mirror, praying the woman wasn't following. That's when she saw it, a face, in the back seat. Her scream filled the car as she swerved, nearly losing control. She spun around, but the back seat was empty. "Get it together, Amanda," she whispered to herself. She tried to calm down, focusing on the road ahead. But then she noticed something horrifying. The odometer wasn't changing. She had been driving for what felt like an eternity, but the numbers on the dash stayed frozen. And then the road stopped. Her car screeched to a halt as she reached the end of the pavement. In front of her, the ground dropped into an endless void, the blackness stretching infinitely in every direction. Amanda's chest tightened as she realized the trees weren't there anymore. The car's headlights barely pierced the darkness around her. A whisper echoed. Low and soft, it sounded like it came from every direction. She couldn't make out the words, but the voice was unmistakable. The woman from the road. The sound grew louder, from whispers to chants, then to cries. The air in the car grew suffocating, and Amanda clutched the wheel, her knuckles white. The chanting stopped. Silence. Then something knocked on her window. Tap! 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 She didn't look. She couldn't. Her eyes were locked forward, but in her peripheral vision she saw movement. Something was crawling up the hood of the car. It moved like a spider, its limbs jerking unnaturally, its head cocked to the side. The face was the same eyeless woman, but her mouth was now stretched impossibly wide, a cavern of blackness filled with rows of jagged teeth. Amanda screamed as the creature lunged, shattering the windshield. Glass rained down as the woman reached for her with clawed hands, pulling herself inside the car. Amanda's world went dark. When her car was found 3 days later, it was abandoned on a road that didn't exist. The police report stated that the vehicle was in perfect condition. No broken windshield, no sign of damage. The only strange thing was Amanda's phone, sitting neatly on the passenger seat. Its camera roll contained one new photo. It was a selfie. Amanda's face, her hollow eye sockets staring back, and the eyeless woman standing behind her smiling. The old well at the edge of Hollow Creek had always been a source of unease. It sat alone in a clearing, surrounded by gnarled trees whose branches seemed to point accusingly toward it. The locals whispered about it, warning their children never to go near. Some claimed it was bottomless, others said it was cursed, but everyone agreed on one thing. Nothing good ever came from the Whispering Well. But 13-year-old Ellie didn't believe in ghost stories. She and her family had just moved to Hollow Creek, and the well intrigued her more than it scared her. Her parents had warned her to stay away, but when curiosity takes hold of a young mind, warnings rarely work. One overcast afternoon, Ellie ventured into the woods, determined to see the infamous well for herself. The path was overgrown, the air heavy with the scent of moss and damp earth. As she neared the clearing, an eerie stillness fell over the forest. No birds chirped, no wind rustled the leaves. It was as if the world was holding its breath. When she finally reached the well, she was surprised by how ordinary it looked. Crumbling bricks covered in moss, an old wooden cover resting precariously on top. The rope for the bucket had long since rotted away. "Some curse," she muttered, stepping closer. That's when she heard it. A voice. Faint, almost imperceptible, drifting up from the depths of the well. She froze, her heart pounding. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. The whisper came again, soft and pleading. "Help me." Ellie hesitated. It had to be a trick, a prank someone was playing. But as she peered over the edge of the well, she saw nothing but darkness. The voice came again, louder this time, more desperate. "Please, don't leave me here." "Who's down there?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. "Just pull me up," the voice replied, shaky and childlike. "Please." Ellie looked around, spotting a long, sturdy branch nearby. She leaned it into the well, her hands trembling as she waited for the person below to grab hold. The branch jerked suddenly, nearly pulling her in. She gasped, planting her feet firmly against the ground. The branch began to move, something climbing up its length. Ellie couldn't see what it was until a pale hand, thin and spindly, emerged over the edge of the well. Then, another hand. They gripped the bricks tightly, their skin sickly gray and stretched too thin over bone. Ellie stumbled back as the figure hoisted itself out of the well. It wasn't a child. It wasn't even human. Its body was impossibly gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long, its face featureless, except for 2 empty sockets where eyes should have been. It tilted its head, as if studying her, then opened its mouth, too wide, stretching across its face, to emit a low, guttural sound. Ellie turned and ran, branches whipping against her face and arms as she tore through the forest. Behind her, she could hear it following, the sound of its limbs snapping and bending in ways no creature should. It moved faster than she thought possible, the sound of its guttural growl growing louder. When she burst out of the woods and into her backyard, the creature stopped. It lingered at the tree line, its eyeless face fixed on her. Then it raised a single hand and pointed back toward the well. Ellie didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house made her flinch, every shadow seemed to shift. But when morning came, she convinced herself it was a nightmare, a trick of her imagination. She didn't tell her parents, they wouldn't believe her anyway. But the whispers didn't stop. Every night, she heard them, soft, insistent, calling her name. And every night, she resisted the pull to return to the well, until she couldn't. 1 week later, her parents woke to find Ellie's bed empty, the front door ajar. Her footprints led into the woods but disappeared near the clearing. When the sheriff searched the well, they found no sign of her. All they found was the branch she had used, splintered and wet, and a faint whisper drifting up from the darkness. "Help me." When Ethan saw the ad for the old manor rental, it seemed like the perfect escape. Secluded, historic, and affordable, the listing boasted. After months of stress at his tech job, a quiet week in the countryside sounded like heaven. He packed his laptop, a few books, and headed out, eager for solitude. The manor stood tall and imposing at the end of a gravel driveway, its stone facade weathered by time. The caretaker, an elderly man named Mr. Harlow, met him at the door. Harlow was polite but oddly hesitant as he handed over the keys. "Stay out of the Crimson Room," Harlow said suddenly, his voice grave. Ethan blinked. "The what?" "The room at the end of the east wing. It's locked, and it's best if it stays that way." Ethan nodded, too eager to start his retreat to press for details. Besides, he wasn't the type to believe in haunted house nonsense. The first day passed peacefully. Ethan spent hours reading in the sunlit parlor and working on his laptop. But as night fell, the house seemed to change. The shadows stretched longer, the air grew colder, and faint creaks echoed through the halls. Lying in bed, he thought he heard footsteps. Soft but deliberate, they moved through the hallway outside his room. Ethan sat up, his heart pounding. "Hello?" he called. Silence. He grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. The hallway was empty, but a faint metallic smell hung in the air. It reminded him of rust or blood. Shaking his head, he retreated to his room, blaming his imagination. The second night was worse. Ethan awoke at exactly 3:12 a.m. to the sound of faint scratching. It was coming from above him. His eyes darted to the ceiling, where faint marks stretched across the plaster, long, thin gouges that hadn't been there before. He tried to ignore them, pulling the blanket over his head like a child. But then he heard it again. The scratching wasn't above him anymore. It was behind the wall. Summoning his courage, Ethan followed the noise through the manor, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The sound led him down the east wing, where the air grew colder with every step. Finally, he stood before a door. The Crimson Room. Despite Harlow's warning, Ethan couldn't stop himself. His hand moved as if it wasn't his own, turning the key in the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a pitch-black room. He stepped inside. The smell hit him first, coppery and rancid, thick enough to make him gag. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating walls streaked with dark stains. In the center of the room stood an old wooden chair, its arms fitted with leather restraints. Something dripped steadily onto the floor beneath it. Ethan's heart raced as he turned to leave, but the door slammed shut. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment he saw them. Figures. Shadowy and indistinct, they stood around him, their hollow eyes gleaming with malice. They whispered, their voices overlapping in a chaotic hum. "Why did you come? Why did you open it?" Ethan backed away, his legs trembling. His flashlight went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they turned into screams. He felt cold hands grab his arms, his shoulders pulling him toward the chair. Then nothing. Ethan woke up in his bed, drenched in sweat. Sunlight streamed through the window. For a brief moment, he thought it had all been a nightmare, but as he sat up, he noticed his hands. They were stained red, the dried blood caked under his nails. His reflection in the mirror revealed more, dark smudges across his face and clothes. Panicking, he rushed to the east wing. The Crimson Room was gone. In its place was a solid wall, as if the door had never existed. Ethan fled the manor without looking back. Weeks later, he tried to contact Harlow, desperate for answers, but the number was disconnected. When he searched for the property online, he found no trace of the listing or the house itself. But every night since, he's woken at 3:12 a.m. to the sound of scratching. And every night, the whispers grow louder. "Why did you open it?" It was the kind of house people crossed the street to avoid. The old Marlowe residence had been empty for decades, its windows boarded up, its paint peeling in long, jagged strips. The stories about it were endless. A cursed family, strange lights at night, the occasional scream heard from within. Nobody dared to go near it, except Mia. Mia had always been drawn to the unexplained, the creepy, the forbidden. So when her friends dared her to spend a night in the Marlowe house, she didn't hesitate. Armed with a flashlight, her phone, and a sleeping bag, she arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The inside of the house smelled of mildew and decay. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung thick in the corners. But there was something else, something faint but acrid, like burnt hair. The first hour was uneventful. Mia set up her sleeping bag in the living room, its fireplace cold and crumbling. She explored the ground floor, documenting the eerie wallpaper patterns and rotted furniture for her Instagram story. Then she heard the footsteps upstairs. She froze. The sound faint but unmistakable, soft, deliberate, and pacing. "Hello?" she called out, her voice more steady than she felt. "Anyone there?" The footsteps stopped. Mia's heart pounded as she climbed the staircase, her flashlight beam flickering across the warped wood. At the top, the hallway stretched out, doors lining either side. Most were ajar, revealing empty, decrepit rooms. But one door at the end of the hall was closed. It hadn't been earlier. As she approached, she noticed something strange. The doorknob was warm, almost hot. Slowly, she turned it and pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for a single window overlooking the overgrown backyard. Mia stepped closer, her flashlight sweeping the space. She stopped when she saw it. A handprint. Pressed against the inside of the dusty glass was a handprint, long and thin, the fingers unnaturally stretched. The sight sent a chill down her spine. Before she could process it, the door slammed shut behind her. Mia spun around, her flashlight flickering wildly. "Who's there?" she shouted. No answer. But as she backed toward the window, she saw something in the glass. A shadow. It stood behind her, tall and formless, its edges shifting like smoke. She turned to face it, but there was nothing there, only the oppressive darkness of the room. The shadow, however, remained in the reflection, growing larger, its form solidifying. And then it moved. The figure stepped forward, not in the reflection, but in the room. Its presence sucked the warmth from the air, and Mia's breath condensed in front of her. She stumbled back, hitting the window, her flashlight clattering to the floor. The shadow loomed over her, its shape now vaguely human but impossibly distorted. A face emerged, or what should have been a face. Instead, there was only a gaping void, blacker than the darkest night. The last thing Mia saw before she blacked out was its hand reaching for her, impossibly long fingers curling around her throat. She woke up outside, sprawled in the overgrown grass of the backyard. Dawn was breaking, the first rays of light painting the house in an eerie glow. Her head throbbed, and her throat burned as if she'd been choking. When she stumbled to her feet, she saw her phone lying nearby. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. She opened the camera app, hoping to find footage of the night's events. There was a video. She pressed play. The footage was shaky, showing her entering the upstairs room. She saw herself finding the handprint, heard her startled gasp. Then the screen turned to static, but the audio remained. A low, guttural voice whispered a single word. Mia deleted the video, grabbed her things, and ran. She never spoke of what happened, but locals say she was never the same after that night. And sometimes when people walk past the Marlowe house, they swear they see her face in the upstairs window, staring out. But Mia's never gone back. Claire loved thrift shopping. She prided herself on finding hidden treasures buried beneath dusty shelves and forgotten corners. That's how she found the mirror. It was tall, almost the height of a door, with a black iron frame twisted into intricate vines and flowers. The glass was remarkably clear, reflecting her image sharply, almost too sharply. She bought it immediately, thinking it would be the perfect addition to her apartment. The shop owner hesitated as she paid. "Are you sure you want this one?" he asked, his voice low. Claire laughed. "Why wouldn't I?" The man didn't answer, only muttering something under his breath as she left. If Claire had been paying attention, she might have caught the words, "It watches." At first, the mirror seemed like a great find. She placed it in her bedroom, opposite the bed, and admired how it made the space feel larger. But within a few days, strange things began to happen. The first night, Claire woke suddenly, her heart racing. She couldn't remember dreaming, but a sense of unease weighed on her. She glanced at the mirror. In the dim light of her bedside lamp, her reflection stared back, calm and still. Too still. Something felt off, but she shook it off and went back to sleep. The second night was worse. She woke again, the same inexplicable panic gripping her. This time, when she looked at the mirror, her reflection wasn't moving. Claire tilted her head to one side, but the reflection remained frozen, staring straight ahead. A cold chill ran through her. She rubbed her eyes and looked again. The reflection was normal now, mimicking her every move. She told herself she was just tired and tried to laugh it off. By the third night, she stopped laughing. Claire woke to the sound of whispers. They were faint, like wind through leaves, but distinctly coming from her bedroom. She sat up, her eyes immediately drawn to the mirror. The whispers stopped. Her reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed and pale. Then it blinked. Claire hadn't blinked. Her breath caught in her throat as the reflection smiled, slowly, unnaturally, stretching its lips too far. She scrambled out of bed, grabbing her phone for light. The reflection tilted its head, watching her every move, its eyes darkening. Claire did the only thing she could think of. She threw a blanket over the mirror, shrouding the glass in darkness. The room fell silent, and she sat trembling on the floor, too scared to go near it. The next day, Claire decided to return the mirror. She hauled it back to the thrift shop, but when she arrived, the store was closed. A handwritten sign on the door read, "Permanently out of business." Frustrated, she left the mirror on the sidewalk and drove away, determined to forget about it. But that night, as she lay in bed, she felt it again, the unmistakable sense of being watched. She turned on the light, heart pounding, and gasped. The mirror was back, leaning against the wall, exactly where it had been before. Claire tried everything to get rid of it. She smashed it with a hammer, but the glass wouldn't crack. She left it at a junkyard, but it always reappeared in her room by the time she got home. She even tried burning it, but the flames seemed to avoid the mirror entirely. And each night the reflection grew stranger. It stopped mimicking her completely, standing perfectly still as Claire moved. Sometimes it whispered to her, soft words she couldn't understand, but felt deep in her bones. Other times, she saw shapes moving in the background of the glass, shadowy figures that grew closer each time she looked. The final night, Claire couldn't take it anymore. She covered the mirror with every blanket, towel, and sheet she could find, but the whispers still seeped through. When she pulled the covers back, her reflection wasn't there. Instead, the glass showed her bedroom. Empty. Claire turned to look behind her, but before she could scream, icy hands grabbed her shoulders and pulled her into the mirror. When her friends reported her missing, the police found nothing unusual in her apartment, except for the mirror. Now, when someone looks into it, they sometimes see a figure standing in the distance. A woman, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. And if you stare too long, you might see her hand press against the glass, as if trying to escape. But she never does. Everyone in Silver Pines knew about the house on Thornridge Lane. It was the last home before the woods, abandoned for decades, with a sagging roof and windows like empty eyes. Kids dared each other to run up and touch the front door, but no one stayed long. They said the house called to you, whispered your name when no one else was around. Mara didn't believe the stories. She was new to town, a college student renting a nearby apartment. When she heard her classmates swapping tales about the haunted house, she rolled her eyes. "It's just an old building," she said. "You're all just scared of shadows." Her friends dared her to go inside, and Mara, ever the skeptic, agreed. "I'll even spend the night," she boasted. She arrived at dusk, a flashlight and sleeping bag in tow. The house loomed above her, its peeling paint gray in the fading light. The air was heavy, the silence unnatural. As she stepped onto the creaking porch, she thought she heard something, a faint whisper carried on the wind. "Mara." She froze, looking around. The street was empty, and the woods were still. Shaking her head, she muttered, "Just my imagination," and pushed open the door. The interior was worse than she'd imagined. The air smelled of mildew and rot. The floorboards groaned beneath her weight, and the wallpaper hung in long, curling strips. Yet, there was something oddly pristine about the staircase in the center of the room. The wood was polished, the banister gleaming. It didn't belong. Ignoring the unease creeping up her spine, Mara explored the house. Most of the rooms were filled with broken furniture and debris, but one stood out. A parlor with a grand piano, its keys pristine despite the decay around it. Dust covered the room except for a clear path leading to the piano bench. She didn't sit down. Something about it felt wrong. Instead, she backed out of the room, her flashlight flickering as she turned to leave. "Mara." The whisper came again, louder this time, more insistent. She spun around, shining her flashlight toward the source. Nothing. The beam caught only empty hallways and peeling walls. "You're losing it," she told herself. But the house had other plans. As night fell, the whispers grew more frequent. Sometimes it was her name, soft and pleading. Other times, it was laughter, low, guttural chuckles that echoed through the halls. The temperature dropped. Her flashlight flickered again, and this time it didn't come back on. Mara cursed, fumbling for her phone to use its light. That's when she saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them, glowing faintly in the darkness, peering at her from the corners of the room, from the cracks in the walls, from the staircase that now looked impossibly long. They blinked, their unblinking stares fixed on her. "Mara, stay." The voices overlapped now, some sweet, some raspy, all of them pulling at her mind. The walls seemed to shift, the hallways stretching and twisting. Every step she took brought her farther from the front door, deeper into the labyrinth the house had become. She found herself in a bedroom. It looked untouched, with a neatly made bed and a single oil lamp glowing on the nightstand. She should have run, but her legs felt heavy, her will slipping away. She sat on the bed, her body moving as if it wasn't her own. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse. Then the door creaked open, and Mara felt the mattress sink beside her. Something invisible, something cold, pressed against her shoulder. It leaned in, and though she couldn't see it, she could feel its breath against her ear. "You belong to us now." Mara was never seen again. The townspeople noticed the change almost immediately. The house, once decayed and lifeless, seemed different. The windows gleamed, the porch was repaired, and the yard was free of weeds. At night, lights flickered in the windows, and if you listened closely, you could hear the faint sound of a piano playing. Sometimes passers-by swear they see a figure standing in the upstairs window, a young woman, her face pale and expressionless. And if you stand too close to the house, you might hear it call your name.